Good evening. We are going to continue our study of character this evening, looking at the characteristic of being merciful, something we could probably all use a little more of, all appreciate when it comes our way, and for whatever reason, even though we understand that, we tend to be a little hesitant to give it to other people sometimes. So we're going to look tonight at mercy, beginning with the definition as we have done throughout the series, and we will look some at merciful as a characteristic of God and maybe what he expects from us as a result of that. So the word merciful, a few ways we might look at it. Compassion or forbearance shown especially to an offender or to one subject of one's power. And so there's an element here that's compassion. I debated a little bit whether to talk about mercy or compassion tonight. I think they are different enough that we'll probably talk about both before we're done with the series. But we'll lean a little more on mercy tonight, which relates specifically to the idea of power. It is one who has power over another, and because of that, you have the ability to give mercy. Now, usually we tend to find ourselves on the wrong side of that equation, looking for mercy from people who have power over us. I think we forget sometimes that there are those that we have power over as well. I mentioned to you this morning that I've been reading a book called Just Mercy. One of the things the author went into was about the death penalty. And I don't want to get off too much on the tangent of that because I know there are strong opinions in every which direction. But he made an interesting point in talking to someone in Germany about the death penalty. And this guy in Germany said, in Germany, we can't have the death penalty here. And his explanation was, what if we did? And if we were to have the death penalty and somewhere along the way, people began running the numbers of statistics and we were executing more Jews than other groups. Given our history, what would people think of that? And so because of that, we can't even entertain the idea of having the death penalty. Even if we thought it was a just way to do things, we just can't do it. And so they acknowledge the fact that as a government, they probably have the power and the authority to do something like that, but they felt like because of all the circumstances around them, they couldn't, and they couldn't go in that direction. And the author goes in all kinds of directions about America and how we treat race and different things, and maybe things we could learn from that. But the gist of it is there are those who have power and those who don't. And when we choose to do the merciful, compassionate kind of thing, we're exercising that power in a good way. Secondly, a blessing that is an act of divine favor or compassion. So it is the acknowledgement that what I'm doing here, not something I have to, but I'm doing it because I want to, because it's a good thing to do. Third, a fortunate circumstance. So maybe you've been somewhere along the way where something has happened to you and you thought, well, that was an act of mercy that came my way. And sometimes those are things where people make choices. Maybe sometimes it's even things where you just feel like, wow, I really was lucky or fortunate or however you may put it, but you didn't have something happen to you that could have. And then fourth, compassionate treatment of those in distress. And I think this is probably the place that we will encounter the ability to show mercy to others more than any other, because it's not quite as dependent on whether they have less power than you or authority than you. It's an acknowledgement of people are in a difficult situation, and how am I going to interact with them? People are in a difficult situation, and even if I think I have decided this is why they're there, this is how it's their fault, this is everything they could have done differently, however we may rationalize our way through it, how are we going to treat them anyway? Because if you think about it for a minute, how often do you think God could look at any one of us when we mess up and we deserve something and say, they knew better, they could have made this choice and this choice and this choice and this choice and not been in the mess they're in right now, but here they are praying to me for mercy. And what shall I do? And my hope would be that we would really want God to err on the side of mercy there. That we would want God to be one that regardless of all the reasoning for why we should have done what we should have done, God is going to be merciful to us. So in turn, we should be merciful to others. So what does Scripture teach about mercy? And it teaches a whole lot. We could look at the word mercy or compassion or things along those lines. But Scripture says a lot about mercy, beginning with the fact that God is merciful. There are things about God that we can never be. There are things about God that we want to try to emulate. And this is one of those things of God that I think we can choose to be like God in this way. In Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 31, it says that for the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them. It's a lot about God in that verse that I really like. The idea that God doesn't just show mercy, But if you were to describe God, one of the ways you would describe God is God is merciful. This is who he is. If you were here this morning, we talked about at the beginning of Ephesians chapter 2 how sin was something that characterized those people in the past, and now being people of God and acting on that behalf was something that was going to characterize them where they were at now. For God, part of who he is, part of his existence, is to be merciful. And then it goes on to describe what that looks like. He's not going to leave you. You ever been left? You ever feel like you have been abandoned? You ever feel like you have been lost by others, or someone has stopped paying attention to you? And you know that feeling of loneliness and abandonment and all that comes. God, first of all, says he's not going to leave. And then he says he's not going to destroy, and he's not going to forget the covenant. How many times throughout Scripture, even in the book of Genesis, shortly after that covenant is first made, do we see people that are beginning to wonder about God's timing, who don't see him in the way they want to see him and begin to wonder what he's up to? He doesn't forget the covenant, and he knows that he swore this to our fathers. So God is there. He is merciful. God's mercy is shown in forgiveness, which is one of those places we really like to interact with the mercy of God because we are in need of a lot of forgiveness from him. The psalmist says in Psalm 78, "Yet he, being compassionate or merciful, atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. He restrained his anger often and did not stir up all his wrath." Now, it's one thing to receive mercy when you feel like you are deserving in some way of that mercy, or you feel like, you have been wrongfully accused, or the thing you're getting is not something you deserve. But there are other times where we're absolutely guilty, aren't there? I've mentioned to you before, I'm in a Facebook group that is a poll of the day. I noticed before I came in here tonight, today's poll of the day question is, how much above the speed limit is reasonable to be pulled over for? And I'd be very curious. I almost thought I should ask this question and get shows of hands, but I'd be very curious what you think of what that number is. I remember when I first learned to drive, there was this belief within my high school of they give you 7. And I would imagine there were probably roads where that was true, that they would give you 7 miles an hour over the speed limit before they do anything. And I also know there were roads that was not true. I had a good friend in high school that got a ticket for doing 39 and a 35. And he was very upset about that. And he thought, I could even just kind of look up for a minute and not realize and look back down. But did he break the speed limit? Yes, he did. Do we think that's reasonable? I won't ask, but you can think whatever you want to think. We have this thing that sometimes we feel like we deserve a certain amount. But God shows us mercy even when we deserve the condemnation, even when we deserve something different. Here it says, he restrained his anger. And what we know about the anger of God is the anger of God is correct. The anger of God is a righteous anger. The anger of God is one that is always just and always right. And so if he has that anger towards a people, that means those people are deserving of that anger. He is completely justified in it. And yet his mercy holds that back. And you have likely at some point experienced that kind of thing in a worldly sense as well, where you were deserving of one thing and you got something very different. You were deserving of a punishment, and you got another chance. And so God at times will give mercy in that way. We also see that God's mercy is shown in prayer, and in a couple different ways we'll see here. In Psalm 27, verse 7, it says, "Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud, be gracious to me and answer me." Now, the beauty of this is, as the psalmist calls this out, all of this request is something that we know that God does. God does hear his people. And God does answer, even though it's not always the way we would like or in the timing we'd like. God hears and God answers. And he shows mercy not just in the answer that is the way we want it to be, but in the fact that he hears to begin with. Think of so many people within our world that are so important and famous and on another level that if you were to try to call them and have a conversation with them, number one, you would never even find their phone number. You wouldn't even know where to begin. And if you did, they wouldn't have the time. People say to you to never meet your idols because you'll be disappointed by that. God is so far to the other end of that spectrum that he is willing, as the creator of the universe, to hear us and to listen and to answer. And then we learn too in Jesus. So when God comes in flesh, Jesus acts in a merciful way as well, which shouldn't surprise us. But it's as if God says, here is how I'm merciful, and now watch what it looks like walking around among you. In Matthew 9 and verse 36, it says that when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. He's not frustrated by them. He's not annoyed by them. He doesn't want to get away and let them just worry about their own stuff. He has compassion on them because he sees the need that they have. He has mercy. We are also called to be merciful to others. So God is merciful. God sends his son here to be merciful among people to show us what it looks like because he wants us to do this for other people. And so the people we encounter, we are to be merciful toward. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 35, Jesus says, "Love your enemies and do good and lend expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of Most High, for he is kind and ungrateful and the evil. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven." Show mercy, and this kind of mercy we showed to you too. Or in Zechariah in the Old Testament, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgments, show kindness and mercy to one another." So in the midst of the idea that we're looking for truth and judgment, we also are looking for mercy. And then one we probably are all familiar with, in the NIV version of this, "He has shown you, O mortal," in Micah 6:8, "what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy," or if you have the ESV or NASB, I think you have kindness here, "to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." So if we were just kind of encompass this walk with God just in a few things, act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. God wants us to be merciful to others. And we should prioritize mercy. Now, it's tough. I've been thinking about throughout the Sunday night series during this year, all these different character traits that we've looked at. If we were to sit down and just start writing them down, I believe this is the 27th one that we've looked at, if I remember right. What if I were to give you the list of 27 and say, okay, put them in order of importance? How crazy would all of our different lists look, as some of us were just absolutely sure this is the most important thing, and these are not quite as much. I wonder where mercy would fall within the midst of this. I would guess that it would be slightly based on how you feel about it right now. How much maybe you need mercy from somebody else or over a situation, and how maybe if you weren't at a point where you needed that, you may not feel like it was quite as important a thing. Or if I were to ask you, as we looked at those character traits, tell me the 5 most important things about being a Christian. Or tell me the 10 most important things about being a Christian. Or what are the 10 things you want to make sure you have right when it comes to your relationship with God? And you were start rattling off answers. You know, we're Church of Christ folks. I imagine baptism is going to be in there somewhere. There's probably going to be something about worship or communion or things like that. And all important, by the way. I wonder if mercy would even make the list. As we started looking at all the things we want to do, all the things we want to get right, and then consider what Jesus says to the Pharisees. He goes through this whole section of woes to you Pharisees and hypocrites, and he lists off all these different things. In Matthew 23 and verse 23, he says this, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law." Now giving, we don't use tithing as much nowadays, but giving, pretty important matter of the law, don't you think? I mean, isn't it important that we give as we have received, as we give, if we have decided to, as we give cheerfully? It's an important thing, and yet he says there are weightier things. And then he says this, "Justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others." Now, the challenge for us is, and by the way, I don't think I would ever come to you with a list of 27 things and tell you to put them in order, because it's just not possible. How do we, once we get beyond the greatest commands that Jesus gave us the answer to, how do we put the rest of these things in order? And the key for us with something like mercy is not just to make it the ones that we like or the ones that we're interested in or the ones that are easily checked off, which I think is what the Pharisees fall into, but all of these things that are so important about how we interact with each other. So he says, woe to you because you're doing these things right, but you're forgetting about these other really important things. And then good judgment includes mercy. We tend to think in judgment in terms of guilt and innocence, of condemnation or freedom, things like that. There is a piece of justice, a piece of good judgment that involves mercy. In James chapter 2 and verse 12, James says, "So speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. For judgment without mercy to one who has shown no mercy, mercy triumphs over judgment." Mercy is so important that even in the midst of judgment, mercy rises to the top. And also wisdom leads to mercy. We've talked a lot about knowledge and wisdom over the last couple weeks. A big part of wisdom is the understanding that mercy is important. James says in chapter 3, verse 17, "But the wisdom from above is first pure, and then peaceable," as we talked about this morning in class, "and then gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere." It's interesting to me with all of these things, and again, I wouldn't want to rank this list either, and it's a much smaller list. But with all of these things, there's one thing that is mentioned that we are to be full of. Not just to have it, not just for it to be part of us, but to be full of mercy. It's as if God understands just how much we all need it. And he wants us to be so full of it that it is overflowing out of us, that we'll have this mercy that goes on to all those around us. And then Jesus puts it very simply that the merciful are blessed. As he lists off all those blessings, the Beatitudes, he says this in Matthew 5 and verse 7, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." And so not only are we blessed in the midst of showing mercy, but as we show that mercy to others, we'll receive mercy too. And that's truly what we need. So 2 biblical stories of mercy to bring this together, and I think we'll probably end early tonight. And I don't want to complain too much about that. First of all, the story of Jonah. And not a specific reference here within Jonah, but the entire story. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on Jonah. Thorne preached on Jonah about a month and a half ago, I think, and did a really good job. But I think Jonah is a really good story of mercy in a lot of different ways. If you remember the story of Jonah, Jonah is supposed to go preach to Nineveh. Jonah does not like Nineveh. So if you could imagine just for a minute, if I were to give you the task to go out and share the message of God with somebody, is there anyone that would come to mind, and don't answer this out loud, by the way, is there anyone that come to mind, any group that would come to mind that you would think to yourself, one of two things, either they will never listen to this, the walls are up too high, they are too against what we're saying, they are not willing, they're not open-minded, they're never going to hear what I'm going to say, and I don't want to waste my time with that. Or two, they're just, I don't even know how to communicate with those people. They're so different than me. They don't have the same values as me. I don't even know where to start. There are probably people who God intends to go talk to those people, but it's not me. It's somebody else. And I think this is kind of Jonah's attitude. There are probably other elements of what Jonah's thinking. And so Jonah's reaction to this is not, well, maybe somewhere else, or I don't really like this idea. Jonah's reaction is to run. Now, running from God, never a good idea. It's not like there's a place you can go where he's not. So Jonah decides he's going to get on a boat and just go as far as he can go. And in the midst of that journey, Jonah finds himself on this boat, and a storm comes up. I was just attacked by a fly. A storm comes up, and he knows it's him. He knows he's the reason for it. Sailors are trying to figure out what's going on, what they need to throw overboard, how they're going to survive. Jonah admits, it's him, and if you throw me over, this will all be okay. Interestingly, by the way, the sailors who are described as very worldly in this story seem to show mercy to Jonah because they're not real quick to the idea of throwing him overboard. This doesn't sound reasonable to them. And they're looking for other solutions and then realize this is what we got to do. And so they throw him over, they're saved, the storm is stopped, and Jonah is swallowed by the whale, fish, whatever you want. I know it says fish, but I would imagine if you were someone in that day and time and saw this giant thing, you would describe that as a fish. We won't get off on that tangent. Jonah is swallowed by something, goes down underwater, and he's down in the depths, and woe is me, is Jonah. And he complains about everything that's going on and what has happened to him. And God, through his mercy, has Jonah spit back out onto the land. And so he's the guy who was swallowed by the whale or the fish, spit back out onto the land. And if I'm Jonah, I think, well, I sure am glad that's over. I thought preaching to Nineveh sounded bad, but being inside a fish for days was worse. But I'm glad I'm at least back on dry land. Now we can get back home, go back to regular life. And God says, oh, by the way, Jonah, you need to go preach to Nineveh. And I imagine if you're Jonah, you're probably thinking, this is how we got here in the first place, but okay. And so he goes to Nineveh, and he begins to preach. And this is his message. It says that Jonah began to go into the city in Jonah 3 and verse 4, going a day's journey, and he called out, yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. This is not how we learned how to do sermons at Harding, but this is Jonah's sermon. He goes in and he tells this lesson over and over again and does not expect what's going to happen. It says in verse 5 that the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest of them to the least of them. Not what he thought. And I would imagine, I don't know, I wasn't there, and I don't know exactly how it went. I would imagine that Jonah's preaching was probably lackluster. I don't imagine Jonah preached with a great attitude. And he went out and gave this message, and they react, and they respond, and they want to change. And it says, the word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. I don't know what we watched over in Britain with all of the things with the Queen over the last week. I did not see this happen. Everything was regal, and everybody was in shiny uniforms and all of that. And here the king of this evil place sets all of this aside, and he is in this state of mourning with everybody else. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. Who knows? God may turn and relent and turn from his fierce anger so that we may not perish. Now, I have had sermons that I have felt like were the best thing I have ever preached, and no one responded. I have had other sermons where I thought to myself, glad that's done. And somebody will come up and respond and then tell me later how great it was and how this was exactly what they needed to hear and all that stuff. What I have not had happen is this. I have not had people come and respond and then leave here and then immediately go tell the other people that they know, you need to hear this message that was just in, share the YouTube video with them. And then people just in droves come to my office the next day and say, we need to know more about this. I try to imagine what this would be like. And then it reached the point where like the city council, they're getting together and have a meeting talking about that sermon that happened over at Southwest. And we need to make all these changes in Ada, and it works its way up the chain. This is what Jonah has happen. And yet, rather than excitement, he's kind of irritated by it. The king's thought is, maybe God will relent if he sees that we're trying. And in verse 10, it says that God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way. God relented the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. And everything changed because God was merciful. And Jonah, we'll find out, by the way, is not. But God is merciful. In the beginning of the story to Jonah, because God does not get rid of Jonah, and God, even though he has gone off and he's run away, when he is thrown overboard, he is saved. And then when Jonah is thrown overboard, the sailors are shown the mercy of God, because they were in the midst of a storm. And by the way, if the sailors are frightened by a storm, it's bad. And they're in the midst of it, and then it is calm, and they're good. And then God again shows mercy to Jonah. Has this fish or this whale swallow him and has him there for 3 days in the midst of that. And even though Jonah is still complaining, he is vomited back out onto shore and he's okay again. And then God shows mercy to Nineveh, this evil, awful place. They respond to the message and God spares them. And then God again, even though Jonah is like the kid who just wants to take his toys and go home, who goes and sits on a hillside hoping God will change his mind again, that Nineveh will be wiped out, God shows mercy to him again and gives him a shade tree to sit there in the heat and watch. And then he takes the shade tree away and reminds him of who he is and what God is. And throughout it, God just shows mercy after mercy after mercy after mercy to all of these people who are not deserving of it. Now, secondly, the parable of the unmerciful servant that we looked at when we looked at parables a year or two ago now, but worth looking at again. Peter asked Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive? And I believe Peter's attitude, Peter's so up and down throughout the Gospels. I believe Peter thinks he's going above and beyond with what he has in mind, but at the same time, there's just a little bit of that kind of Pharisee mentality of, I want to know how many I have to check off and then I can be done with this. So he says, Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive? Gets a very unexpected answer, and then Jesus tells this story. Therefore, Matthew 18, verse 23, therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed 10,000 talents, which is, by the way, an obscene amount of money to us nowadays. The kind of money where maybe you have one of those debts where you think to yourself, I will keep making payments on this to the day I die, but it will never go away. There are people who have things that are like that. Maybe you're one of them. But it's always there. And so the king brings this guy in, and he's going to forgive something that has been over this guy's head forever. As since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and his children and all that he had in payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, or maybe mercy for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. He received mercy. He deserved, you have to pay this, you're going to have to do everything you can ever do, sell everything you have to pay it. But instead, he received mercy. And if you have ever received mercy on this scale, and I know those of you who have followed Jesus have, not on a worldly kind of scale, but you have received mercy that you absolutely do not deserve, just as I have. But for some of us, in worldly senses, we have received mercy like this, where there was a thing we could not fix on our own, and that someone decided, someone with authority over us, to release us of that debt. It is life-changing, isn't it? It is one of those moments, I mean, quite honestly, even if you just pay the debt off, it's kind of life-changing. But when it is just taken away, it is life-changing. For this guy whose life was probably all about this debt and how it would never change, was completely changed on that day. And what would you do if that was your experience? If you were given a gift that you could never, ever get on your own, you were given mercy that you could never have achieved. If something that has been held over your head forever is taken away, how would you feel about that? And I think most of us would feel so unbelievably grateful that we wouldn't even know how to react. You would always want to thank that person when you encountered them. You would always remember that day, and with people that you're willing to let in enough to your personal story, you would tell them about that and how different life was before and after that moment. And that's what you want for this guy. But if you know the story, that's not how it goes. But when that saved servant went out, he's now freed of this debt that he had. When he went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Now, that compared to the obscene amount of money he owed is a minuscule amount of money, but still a big deal to this guy who owes it. Still something that's difficult for him to come up with. So he owes a small amount, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, "Pay what you owe." It's so frustrating to read, isn't it? And yet, I believe that Jesus tells parables because there's enough reality in them that they're familiar. Because you will see this kind of thing unfold. You will see people who receive something amazing act in incredibly unmerciful and ungrateful kinds of ways. And so this guy is he's out for blood. And so his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him. Looks kind of familiar from a few verses back, doesn't it? He fell down and he pleaded. I don't know how frequently in life you have fell down and pleaded for something. I tell you that those are the times where you are absolutely broken and just at your wit's end and at the end of your rope, and you don't know what else to do, and you just beg. And so this guy, he fell down and he pleaded with him, saying, "Have patience with me and I will pay you." Familiar words again, aren't they? Just have patience. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. He did not give mercy, to put it lightly. He was given this incredible mercy he didn't deserve, had the opportunity very quickly afterwards to then show that type of mercy to somebody else, and did not give it. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed. I believe probably understatement here. They probably cannot believe what they're seeing. They're greatly distressed, and they went and reported their master and all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers, and until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. Those are some of the most terrifying words I have ever read in the New Testament. And there are so many things just in these few verses. Looking back here for a second, when he calls him wicked and says, "What I did for you is because you pleaded," and we have probably been there somewhere along the way. And then he says, "As I had mercy on you." This is what you should have done. You saw what I did, and you did something different. And then, if you don't forgive, you're not going to be forgiven. The mercy that we received relates directly to the mercy that we give. We have received mercy that is not explainable. If the entire Bible had been written just about the mercy God has shown to us, it would need to be longer. You cannot put into words what has been done for us. And because of that, it should change everything about how we treat other people. Think about the times we get impatient with people because they don't deserve better. Think of the times where people make mistakes and you could point at all the mistakes that led them to where they are and how they should have fixed those things. And you can be correct about all of that. They could have brought all this on themselves with what they did. But none of that changes the fact that we have been given mercy far beyond what we deserve. And what God asks of us is to then in turn show that mercy to others. So are we doing that? Are we showing mercy to others, or is the judgment that we give, is mercy not triumphing over that? Is the judgment we give way too much about condemnation and not nearly enough about mercy? Because I believe there is probably one that is really qualified to make that decision, and he is the one we've come here to worship tonight. He knows where there's the thing that is deserved and the thing that is not, but for us, let's just keep erring on the side of mercy. Let us be people that show mercy to others, the kind of mercy we would want to be shown. Tonight, there's a good chance that there are people here or people watching online who have not been shown a whole lot of mercy in life. Who instead you've had just a lot of people that have told you everything you've done wrong, what you should have done differently, who have been there with an awful lot of I told you so's. And all those tend to do most of the time is just make you feel that much worse about where you're at. I will tell you there is a God who desires to show you mercy that would just like for you to follow him and to live life in the way that he has designed it for you. You can be baptized into him tonight, and you can receive the greatest mercy you will ever receive that will far outshine anything else. Or if you have just not been shown a lot of mercy in life, you feel like maybe you have bought into what the world thinks of Christianity, which is we're just a bunch of judgmental, hypocritical kind of people. We have some of those just like everybody else does. I will tell you at the same time, the world has an awful lot of those too. What we want to do instead is to show mercy because we have been shown mercy. If you need that kind of mercy tonight in your life, please come while we stand and sing.